the drink that was never meant for humans right now, somewhere in the world. Millions of people are pouring milk over cereal, stirring it into coffee, or drinking it straight from a glass without giving it a second thought. It feels so ordinary that few ever stop to ask one simple question. Why are humans the only species on Earth that willingly drinks the milk of another animal? No lion steals milk from a buffalo. No wolf waits beside a sheep hoping for fresh milk. No chimpanzee builds a farm to milk another mammal. Among the millions of species that have ever lived, humans stand completely alone. Even stranger, nature never intended adults to drink milk at all. For nearly every mammal, milk is temporary. It is a food designed exclusively for newborns. Once an animal grows strong enough to survive on solid food, its body quietly shuts down the ability to digest lactose, the natural sugar found in milk. Dogs lose it. Cats lose it. Elephants, whales, bears, deer, and even our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, all lose it. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans did exactly the same. Then something extraordinary happened. A tiny mutation appeared in a handful of people. At first it seemed completely insignificant, but over thousands of years that single genetic accident helped reshape civilizations, fueled migrations across continents, changed agriculture forever, influenced wars, altered human DNA, and eventually created an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. This is not simply the story of milk. It is the story of one of the most unlikely partnerships in human history. But before farms, before cows, and before villages, humans lived in a world where obtaining food meant risking death almost every single day. More than 300,000 years ago, our ancestors wandered across the African savannas in small bands of hunter-gatherers. They owned no fields, built no permanent homes, and certainly kept no livestock. Every meal depended on the seasons, the weather, and pure luck. Some days they found berries, roots, or edible plants. Other days they hunted gazelles or scavenged the leftovers abandoned by lions and hyenas. Survival was never guaranteed. The world itself looked dramatically different from today. Vast grasslands stretched across regions now covered by forests. Giant mammals roamed the landscape. Mammoths crossed the cold plains of Eurasia. Woolly rhinoceroses grazed beneath frozen skies. Massive aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cattle, moved through valleys and open woodlands in powerful herds. These animals were nothing like today's farm cows. A fully grown aurochs could stand nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder and weigh well over 1,000 kilograms. Their horns could exceed 80 centimeters in length, making them among the most dangerous herbivores of prehistoric Europe and Western Asia. Ancient hunters respected them. Sometimes entire hunting parties were killed trying to bring down a single animal. The idea of approaching one and attempting to collect milk would have been unimaginable. Milk belonged to calves. Humans hunted the adults. That relationship remained unchanged for tens of thousands of years. Then the planet itself began to transform. Around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age slowly came to an end. Massive glaciers that had covered much of North America and Northern Europe retreated. Sea levels rose. Forests expanded. Rainfall patterns shifted. Across the Near East, the Caucasus, and parts of Anatolia, warmer temperatures encouraged the growth of wild wheat, barley, lentils, and other edible plants. For the first time in history, some human communities discovered that food could be grown instead of constantly searched for. This transition did not happen overnight. It took centuries of experimentation. Families returned to the same fertile valleys every year, harvesting wild grain before eventually planting seeds themselves. Temporary camps gradually became permanent settlements. History calls this transformation the Neolithic Revolution. It changed everything. People no longer needed to spend their entire lives chasing migrating animals. Instead, villages appeared. Storage pits filled with grain. Stone houses replaced temporary shelters. Population numbers slowly increased. And with larger communities came an entirely new challenge. People needed reliable food all year long. Wild game could disappear. Harvests could fail. Drought could destroy crops. Communities needed another source of survival. That solution arrived on 4 legs. The earliest domesticated animals were probably goats. Unlike large wild cattle, goats were surprisingly adaptable. They survived on sparse vegetation, climbed rocky hillsides, reproduced quickly, and could accompany humans almost anywhere. Soon after came sheep, then pigs. Eventually, people began the far more dangerous process of domesticating the enormous wild cattle that had terrified hunters for thousands of years. This was not simply taming wild animals. Generation after generation, humans unknowingly practiced selective breeding. The calmest calves survived. The least aggressive bulls reproduced. Over hundreds of years, wild oryx slowly evolved into smaller, more manageable cattle. Without realizing it, humans were beginning one of the greatest biological partnerships in history. Most people assume milk was the original reason these animals were domesticated. Surprisingly, that isn't true. The earliest farmers valued livestock primarily for meat, hides, bones, manure, and eventually labor. Oxen could pull primitive plows. Animals provided leather for clothing. Bones became needles, fishhooks, and tools. Milk was almost an afterthought. There was one enormous problem. Adults simply couldn't digest it. Fresh milk contained lactose, a sugar that required an enzyme called lactase. Children naturally produced plenty of lactase. Adults did not. Drinking raw milk often resulted in severe stomach pain, bloating, cramps, nausea, and diarrhea. For ancient communities already struggling to survive, becoming sick after drinking valuable food made very little sense. So early farmers looked for another solution. Instead of trying to change themselves, they accidentally changed the milk. One forgotten discovery would quietly become one of humanity's greatest food innovations. Legend tells of a shepherd traveling across the hot lands of Western Asia, carrying fresh milk inside a pouch made from a young animal's stomach. Hours later, when he finally opened the container, the liquid had transformed. Soft white curds floated in pale yellow liquid. The milk had become cheese. Whether this story is true or not, nobody knows. But the science behind it certainly is. The lining of a calf's stomach naturally contains rennet, an enzyme capable of separating milk into solid curds and liquid whey. Combined with naturally occurring bacteria and warm temperatures, it created one of history's first preserved foods almost by accident. Unlike fresh milk, aged cheese contained far less lactose. Many adults who became sick from drinking milk could eat cheese with little or no discomfort. It was an extraordinary discovery. Soon people learned that milk left to ferment naturally became yogurt. Other cultures created kefir. In the mountains of the Caucasus, fermented dairy products became valuable sources of nutrition during long winters. Across Central Asia, nomadic tribes developed entirely different dairy traditions using mare's milk instead of cow's milk. Without understanding microbiology, ancient people had discovered fermentation thousands of years before science could explain why it worked. This wasn't simply cooking. It was one of humanity's earliest examples of biotechnology, and it solved a problem that evolution had never intended to solve. Yet, even this remarkable innovation was only the beginning, because somewhere, in a child whose name has been lost forever, nature itself was about to rewrite the human story, the mutation that changed humanity for thousands of years. Cheese and fermented dairy products helped early farming communities survive. They lasted longer than fresh milk, were easier to transport, and caused far fewer digestive problems. To ancient people, they were practical foods, not signs of a biological revolution. But nature was preparing something far more remarkable. Somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago, a child was born carrying a tiny mutation in their DNA. It did not make them stronger. It did not make them faster. It did not change the way they looked. Instead, it allowed their body to keep producing lactase long after childhood. For the first time in human history, an adult could drink fresh milk without becoming sick. No one noticed. The child grew up like everyone else. Yet during years of poor harvests or long droughts, they possessed an invisible advantage. While others struggled to digest fresh milk, they could drink it safely and gain valuable calories, protein, fat, calcium, and clean fluids from the same animal every single day. One cow could provide nourishment for years without being slaughtered. It was a completely different way of thinking about food. Instead of killing livestock for a single large meal, families could keep animals alive and receive a continuous supply of nutrition. That simple difference slowly changed entire economies. Modern genetic studies suggest this mutation spread rapidly because survival favored those who possessed it. In regions where dairy farming became common, people with lactase persistence were more likely to survive famines, raise healthy children, and pass their genes to future generations. Evolution was no longer being driven only by nature. Human culture had become part of the process. Scientists call this gene culture coevolution a rare phenomenon, in which human behavior changes the direction of biological evolution itself. Milk became one of its greatest examples. One of the cultures most closely connected with this transformation was the Yamnaya, a group of Bronze Age pastoralists who lived across the Pontic Caspian steppe. Their lives revolved around vast grasslands, stretching across what is now Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan. Unlike settled farmers, these people moved with enormous herds of cattle, sheep, and horses. Milk traveled with them. Their wagons carried fermented dairy products across thousands of kilometers, allowing them to survive where traditional farming was almost impossible. Recent ancient DNA research has shown that populations connected to the Yamnaya spread across much of Europe around 5,000 years ago. Along with new technologies, domesticated horses, and pastoral traditions, they also help spread genes associated with adult lactose digestion. This helps explain why Northern Europe today has some of the world's highest rates of lactose tolerance. In countries such as Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Ireland, most adults can digest fresh milk without difficulty. But this pattern is far from universal. In East Asia, where dairy farming developed very differently, lactose intolerance remains common. Across much of Southeast Asia, many adults naturally lose the ability to digest lactose after childhood. In parts of South America, inherited genetics vary depending on ancestry. The same is true across the Middle East. This surprises many people. A common myth claims that humans simply evolved to drink milk. The truth is far more complicated. Humanity never evolved in one direction. Different populations adapted to different environments. Where dairy became an important food source, natural selection often favored lactase persistence. Where it did not, the mutation remained rare. Even more fascinating, Europe was not the only place where this adaptation appeared. Scientists have discovered entirely separate genetic mutations among pastoral communities in East Africa. Groups living in modern Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Sudan independently evolved the ability to digest milk as adults. This is one of evolution's most remarkable examples of convergent evolution. Different populations, separated by thousands of kilometers, developed different genetic solutions to the same challenge. The result was nearly identical. Adults who could safely drink milk gained an advantage in environments where livestock meant survival. In the dry regions of East Africa, cattle were more than a source of wealth. They represented food security during seasons when crops failed. Fresh milk provided hydration as well as nutrition, making it especially valuable in hot climates. Meanwhile, on the windswept grasslands of Central Asia, nomadic horse cultures discovered another remarkable resource: mare's milk. Unlike cow's milk, mare's milk was commonly fermented into a mildly alcoholic drink known today as kumis. For centuries, Turkic and Mongol tribes carried this drink across the Eurasian steppe. Travelers who visited these nomads often described enormous leather bags hanging beside tents, constantly stirred as the milk fermented throughout the day. To outsiders it seemed strange. To the nomads, it was simply another ingenious adaptation to life on the open plains. Milk was no longer just food. It had become culture. It appeared in religious ceremonies, seasonal festivals, and family traditions. In ancient India, dairy products were considered sacred and became deeply connected with Hindu rituals. Clarified butter, known as ghee, burned in temple lamps and was used during important ceremonies. Across the Mediterranean, shepherd communities relied on sheep and goat milk to produce cheeses that could survive long sea voyages. In the mountains of the Balkans, fermented dairy became a daily staple. Every civilization found its own way to transform the same simple ingredient. Yet despite these differences, one question continues to spark debate even today. Is milk truly a perfect food? The answer is more complicated than advertisements often suggest. Milk contains high-quality protein, essential amino acids, calcium, phosphorus, vitamin B12, and many other nutrients. For growing children, these nutrients can play an important role in healthy development. However, milk is not biologically necessary for every adult. People who cannot digest lactose can obtain the same nutrients from fish, leafy vegetables, legumes, nuts, fermented dairy products, or fortified foods. Another widespread myth claims that drinking large amounts of milk automatically creates stronger bones. Scientific research paints a more balanced picture. Bone health depends on many factors, including exercise, vitamin D, total diet, genetics, and overall lifestyle, not milk alone. Like many foods, dairy can be beneficial for some people while being unsuitable for others. There is no universal rule that applies to every human being. The story of milk has never been black and white. It has always been a story of adaptation, a story written not only by biology, but by geography, climate, culture, and thousands of years of human innovation. And soon, milk would become something even greater. It would help feed armies, sustain empires, and support civilizations that stretched across continents. How milk helped build civilizations by the beginning of the Bronze Age. Milk was no longer just another source of food. It had become a resource capable of supporting entire societies. Unlike grain, which could fail after a drought, or hunted animals that disappeared with the changing seasons, livestock offered something unique. Cattle, goats, sheep, camels, and horses could transform grasses that humans could never eat into nutrient-rich food every single day. This simple biological process gave pastoral communities an incredible advantage. Instead of depending entirely on harvests, they possessed a living food supply that could move with them across mountains, deserts, and endless grasslands. As civilizations expanded, dairy became woven into their economies, religions, and daily lives. In the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, where some of the world's earliest cities emerged, cattle represented both wealth and stability. Clay tablets written more than 4,000 years ago describe herds owned by temples and royal households. These records carefully counted cows, goats, sheep, butter, and cheese alongside grain harvests and taxes. Milk had become valuable enough to record in writing. Temple workers processed enormous quantities of dairy products to feed priests, laborers, and officials. Butter and cheese lasted much longer than fresh milk, making them ideal for storage during dry seasons when food became scarce. Far to the southwest, along the Nile River, ancient Egypt developed its own dairy traditions. Wall paintings inside tombs show servants milking cows, carrying jars of fresh milk, and preparing cheese. Wealthy families enjoyed dairy products as part of their daily diets, while farmers relied on cattle for far more than food. They plowed fields, transported goods, provided fertilizer, and only after years of work were they eventually slaughtered for meat. Milk allowed these valuable animals to continue supporting families throughout their lives. Further east, on the Indian subcontinent, dairy became deeply intertwined with both agriculture and spirituality. As farming communities expanded across the fertile plains, cows gradually gained extraordinary cultural importance. Milk, yogurt, butter, and clarified butter known as ghee became essential ingredients in cooking, medicine, and religious ceremonies. Ancient Hindu texts frequently describe dairy as a symbol of prosperity, generosity, and abundance. Even today, many traditional rituals continue to include milk or ghee as sacred offerings. The connection between humans and dairy had become something much greater than simple nutrition. It had become identity. Across the rugged mountains of the Caucasus, shepherds relied on sheep and goats rather than cattle. The steep terrain made large herds difficult to manage, but smaller animals thrived among rocky slopes and alpine meadows. Families developed unique cheeses capable of lasting through harsh winters. Generation after generation, recipes were passed down without anyone understanding the microorganisms responsible for fermentation. Knowledge survived through tradition rather than science. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away, another civilization was mastering an entirely different relationship with milk. The nomadic peoples of Central Asia spent much of their lives on horseback. The open Eurasian steppe stretched farther than the eye could see, creating one of the largest continuous grasslands on Earth. Growing crops here was difficult. Raising animals was not. Horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and yaks became the foundation of survival. Milk accompanied these nomads everywhere they traveled. Fresh milk rarely lasted long in the summer heat, so it was transformed into fermented drinks. Dried cheese, yogurt, and other preserved foods that could survive weeks of migration. Every member of the family participated. Children learned to milk animals almost as soon as they could walk. Women often processed dairy products while camps moved across the grasslands. Nothing was wasted. Centuries later, these same traditions helped support one of history's most extraordinary empires. When Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes in the early 13th century, his armies achieved something few believed possible. Mounted warriors crossed deserts, mountains, frozen rivers, and endless plains faster than any enemy expected. Historians often focus on their horses, military tactics, and discipline, but logistics mattered just as much. Each warrior traveled with multiple horses, allowing exhausted animals to rest while fresh mounts took their place. Dried meat supplied protein. Fermented mare's milk provided calories and hydration. Hard cheeses could survive weeks without spoiling. Unlike large medieval armies that depended on vulnerable supply lines, Mongol forces often carried much of their food with them. Their mobility became one of their greatest weapons. Milk had quietly become part of military history. In Northern Europe, dairy shaped society in different ways. Long winters shortened growing seasons and reduced agricultural productivity. Keeping cattle alive through freezing months required enormous effort, but the reward was substantial. Butter and aged cheeses stored valuable calories that could sustain families until spring. By the Viking Age, dairy products had become common across Scandinavia. Archaeological excavations have uncovered churns, cheese molds, and residues of milk fats preserved inside ancient pottery. Even seafaring explorers benefited. Ships traveling across the North Atlantic often carried hard cheeses that resisted spoilage far better than fresh food. Milk had become fuel for exploration. As trade expanded during the Middle Ages, cheese emerged as one of Europe's most valuable preserved foods. Different regions developed their own specialties. Mountain villages perfected hard cheeses capable of aging for years. Coastal communities experimented with softer varieties. Monasteries became centers of agricultural innovation, refining production techniques that would later spread across the continent. Many of today's famous cheeses trace their origins back hundreds of years. Yet despite its growing importance, milk remains surrounded by myths. One popular belief claimed that drinking milk immediately after eating fish was poisonous. This myth still exists in parts of the world today. Medical research has found no evidence supporting the claim for healthy individuals. Another widespread belief suggested that raw milk was always healthier than processed milk, simply because it was natural. History tells a different story. Before modern sanitation, raw milk frequently carried dangerous bacteria responsible for diseases such as tuberculosis, brucellosis, typhoid fever, and other deadly infections. For thousands of years, people had no idea why some villages suddenly became sick after consuming fresh milk. The invisible world of bacteria remained completely unknown. That mystery would only be solved centuries later. Ironically, one of humanity's oldest foods was about to collide with one of history's greatest scientific discoveries. The age of tradition was coming to an end. The age of modern science was about to begin.